welcome to the UN Brief. Today we interviewed Jose-Antonio Monteiro. He is an economist in the Economic Research and Statistics Division of the World Trade Organization. Besides providing economic advice to dispute settlement panels, he conducts research on international trade issues, including sustainable e-commerce, environment, and labor. Among other things, he co-authored the WTO UNCTAD Advanced Guide to Trade Policy Analysis, the Structural Gravity Model, and coordinated the joint WTO World Bank report on women and trade in the 2017 and 2021 World Trade Reports. Before joining the WTO, he worked at the International Labour Organization in the Trade and Labour Program, with a particular focus in labour provisions in regional trade agreements. He holds a PhD in economics in the area of trade and environment from the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland, and a Master on Economics and Finance from the University of Geneva. Thank you for watching the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe.
The World Trade Report 2021 looks at the role of trade, trade policy, and international cooperation in economic resilience in the face of natural and man-made disaster. And the three main takeaways of the report are, first, that globalization has made our economy more exposed to risks and exposed to shocks, but at the same time, it makes our economy more resilient to these shocks and to be able to cope and recover from these shocks more efficiently. And if you look, for instance, at the pandemic, it's a good example of how trade played an important role. First, on the one hand, tourism and movement of people allowed the virus to spread across countries, but at the same time, globalization contributed to the development of vaccines and the production of billions of vaccine doses in record time. We also see now with the recovery that trade is playing an important role for many countries, including developing countries, in recovering faster thanks to international trade. Turning to the second main finding, strategies that aim at improving economic resilience by reshoring production, promoting self-sufficiency, or unwinding trade integration can actually reduce economic resilience. And so if you look at, for instance, national supply chains, yes, it's true, they can reduce the exposure of external shocks, but they are still exposed to domestic shocks and to domestic disruption, and they don't have access or cannot benefit from the resilience mechanisms offered by trade. And for some goods, it's the complexity of the production process and distribution process. Building a domestic supply chain seems, in some cases, very expensive and maybe even not feasible. And the last main finding of the report is that in order to build economic resilience, you need more international cooperation. International cooperation backed by strong international trade rules can use and exploit synergies and also support all the different domestic strategies adopted to build and support economic resilience. And for instance, the report looks at the role of the WTO, and it shows that the WTO is already contributing to economic resilience by, for instance, promoting the transparency of trade policies, by ensuring that the trade environment is predictable, but also, for instance, by supporting trade diversification, by reducing trade costs and also promoting streamlined custom procedures.
And why is trade diversification important for countries?
Yes, actually, diversification is a key component of many strategies, not only those that relates to international trade. In the case of international trade and trade diversification, it can take different forms. You can have diversification of products and services that you trade internationally. You can have trade diversification in terms of suppliers and export destination markets. You can also have diversification in terms of trade routes and mode of transportation. And so trade diversification contributes to economic resilience throughout the different stages of economic resilience. So for instance, if you look at before the shock occurs, trade diversification reduces the risks by the exposure to risks, by spreading the risk during the time of crisis. And once the shock is gone or under control, trade diversification can support economic recovery. And this is what we observe today with the pandemic. Trade, enables countries to benefit from foreign demand on the export side, and also from the availability of inputs on the import side. And so many countries, including many developing countries, are currently recovering faster, in large part thanks to international trade.
Trade policies affect how countries address climate change.
Yes, the report looks at the role of trade in the context of climate change, and it notes that on the one hand, yes, trade increases and generates greenhouse gas emissions, and so contributes to climate change, but it's also part of the solution to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And if you look at this aspect, the positive role of trade in climate change, what we observe is that trade openness usually leads to higher income, which then enables consumers, or some consumers, who are willing to pay a higher premium price to buy environmentally friendly goods and services. Many consumers and voters also tend to demand stringent environmental regulation, and so governments tend to adopt such stringent environmental policies, and they also have additional financial resources that enables them to implement and monitor the implementation of good environmental policies. And finally, the role of trade is also important with the trade of environmental goods and services, which are very important not only to mitigate climate change, if you think about renewable energy, but also to adapt to climate change. And in that context, trade policy can play an important role. And if you look at policies, trade policies that reduces the trade costs faced by environmental goods and services, think of high tariffs, which tend to be relatively high actually for some environmental goods in developing countries. This can contribute to climate change mitigation. Addressing also non-tariff barriers is important. You can think of harmonizing relevant standards or promoting mutual recognition of conformity assessment procedures. Obviously, looking at environmental goods is important, but looking also at environmental services is key, because what we observe is that, in order to adopt and use environmental goods, or some environmental goods, you need environmental services. You need someone to install the solar panel before being able to generate solar energy. And so addressing also all the trade barriers faced by environmental services is very important. And in that context, there is ongoing discussion among WTO members to revive the environmental goods agreement. And I think this is a good news to ensure trade and trade policy can contribute to climate change, the fight against climate change.
Thank you for watching the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe,